Let's talk about Ivanhoe. So, Ivanhoe is a romance published by Sir Walter Scott in 1819, and it's considered to be a classic. From what I've seen online, there hasn't been too much discourse, but from what I found, a few people thought that this book was kind of long winded, a little boring, which I thought was a little surprising because I had a really good time. For me, it's a light adventure comedy. It's not to be taken too seriously. The book is kind of akin to like a Pirates of the Caribbean. And what I think is so funny is that Sir Walter Scott wanted to create an immersive experience with this book. So the dialogue is modeled after Shakespeare, which I think is really funny because he made the book more difficult to read than it had to be. So it was written in the 1800s, but the language, again, is Shakespearean. And this book takes place in the 12th century. And in the 12th century, they were speaking Middle English. So it doesn't really even create an immersive experience because we're not actually getting the language that they were speaking at the time. But I love it. I think it's really funny. And in order to really talk about this book, first you have to get to the history. The novel takes place in the 12th century. A century earlier, during the Norman conquest of 1066, William the Conqueror comes over from France and establishes Norman rule in England. We cut forward again to the 12th century, takes place during the reign of King Richard I, otherwise known as Richard the Lionheart. And this was also shortly after the Third Crusade. Richard and John were sons of King Henry II of England, and Richard wasn't supposed to be king. He's actually the third son, but his older brothers passed away, which made him heir. And that made John super salty. He was left out of all the inheritance arrangements. And after King Richard became king in 1189, he almost immediately went off to fight in the crusade to reclaim Jerusalem. Meanwhile, John plots to take over the throne of England. He plots with other nobles, and he even spreads a rumor that Richard is dead, but he's not dead. And Richard is coming back from the crusade, and while he's coming back, he's captured in Austria and held for ransom. Eventually, his mom gets him out, so he returns back to England in 1194. So the novel begins after King Richard has been captured upon returning from the crusade. So he's captured in Austria. Meanwhile, Prince John has taken over the throne, and all the powerful nobles are Normans who have been seizing the land of the Saxon nobles, turning the Saxons into serfs. And here we meet Gurth, who's a swineherd, and Wamba, who's a jester. Walter Scott describes a metal collar around Gurth's neck, which is not historically accurate. Walt took a lot of liberties in writing this book and in the historical information for this book. And what's interesting is that Mark Twain has blamed Sir Walter Scott and his novel Ivanhoe for starting the American Civil War. And this is namely due to the fact that Ivanhoe became really popular in the South. It focuses on themes such as chivalry and titles and land ownership. And Mark Twain has said that
Sir Walter had so large a hand in making Southern character, as it existed before the war, that he is in great measure responsible for the war. It seems a little harsh toward a dead man to say that. We never should have had any war but for Sir Walter, and yet something of a plausible argument might perhaps be made in support of that wild proposition.
Mark Twain did think that Sir Walter Scott is to blame for the American Civil War. He's not the only one for thinking that. But also, I've discovered that Mark Twain is just kind of a grumpy cat. He has also dissed Jane Austen, and he is known for saying, "Every time I read Pride and Prejudice, I want to dig her up and beat her over the skull with her own shin bone." But that's neither here or there. So back to the conversation. Girth, like I said, is the swineherd. Wamba is the jester. They're having a conversation. And what they're talking about is actually the first thing that I think about when I think about the Norman conquest. Not that I think about the Norman conquest, but when I do, it's about the English language, which is what they're discussing. When William the Conqueror became king, French became the language of the ruling elite, which is why the English language has so many Latin roots. So all the words that we would associate with nobility, so words entered into religion, into government, into law. What Girth and Wamba are discussing is how we have two words for animals. So the words beef, poultry, pork come from the noble Normans, and the words chicken, cow, and pig come from the Anglo-Saxon farmers. And it's the fusion of the French with the Old English that eventually turned into Middle English. While Girth and Wamba are having this riveting conversation, a group of people comes up, which includes one of our main villains, Briand de Bois Guilbert, and they ask for directions to Cedric's castle. Cedric is a Saxon landowner, and Wamba and Girth are his servants. So Wamba gives them the wrong directions, but fortunately, as the group is traveling, they come upon a pilgrim who does point them in the right direction. At the castle, we meet Cedric and Rowena. Rowena is Cedric's ward. She is of noble Saxon birth. She's described as incredibly beautiful, blonde hair, blue eyes, and Cedric wants Rowena to marry Athelstane, who's also of noble Saxon birth, and he believes that their marriage would strengthen Saxon rule. And what's interesting is that Cedric is also the father of Ivanhoe, and he has disowned Ivanhoe because Ivanhoe went off to fight in the Crusade with King Richard, and that's a problem for Cedric because Cedric is all about the Saxon nobility. He's all about reestablishing Saxon rule. And he doesn't like King Richard because King Richard is a Norman. And so he has disowned Ivanhoe.
I have no son. He deserted me, he deserted his Saxon blood.
And Ivanhoe and Rowena have sort of also liked each other since they were little kids. While they're all dining, we also meet Isaac of York, who's a Jew. He comes in, Cedric welcomes him, and this is where it gets kind of heavy or dark. So the discrimination in this book, the anti-Semitism, goes hard. As soon as Isaac comes in, he's very apologetic for his existence, and even though Cedric has welcomed him into the dining hall, no one gives him space to sit down. Everyone demonstrates that he's not welcome here. Isaac of York has been modeled after Shylock. The physical characteristic, the personality is very similar to Shylock, but everyone is incredibly mean to him. Only the pilgrim gives space for Isaac to sit down. And also at this dinner, we find out that Briand de Bois Guilbert and another villain, De Bracy, are off on their way to a tournament, the Ashby tournament. This book is actually divided into 3 sections: the Ashby tournament, the capture at Torquilstone, and the trial. Let's start with the Ashby tournament. We start off with Isaac on his way to the Ashby tournament. He's traveling with his daughter, Rebecca, who is described as incredibly beautiful, and they get attacked. But the pilgrim saves them. And in gratitude, Isaac offers the pilgrim armor and a horse. On the first day of the tournament, the pilgrim, who goes by the Disinherited Knight, ends up beating everybody, including Briand de Bois Guilbert, who's supposed to be the best of the best. And as the winner, the Disinherited Knight gets to choose the Queen of Love and Beauty, and he chooses Rowena. And Prince John is also in attendance, and Prince John is kind of irked because, first of all, the Disinherited Knight doesn't remove his helmet, so he doesn't show who he is, and he chose a Saxon woman as the Queen of Love and Beauty. On the second day of the tournament, everybody is fighting the Disinherited Knight, and this includes Athelstane, De Bracy, Briand de Bois Guilbert, and he's doing pretty well. But in times where he's struggling, this Black Knight swoops in, this mysterious Black Knight who's described as kind of very lazy. He kind of stays back most of the time and then he swoops in whenever trouble arises. So he helps out the Disinherited Knight, and he's described as the Black Sluggard. So the Disinherited Knight ends up winning, and then Rowena removes his helmet to discover that, oh my gosh, it's Ivanhoe. Who would have guessed? But unfortunately, Ivanhoe is badly injured, and so he shortly after faints. So Rebecca, Isaac's daughter, ends up taking care of Ivanhoe because she's also a healer. This woman is just a woman of all trades. She is really adept at being a healer. She's also, again, insanely beautiful. And her and Ivanhoe have a moment, but that moment is gone when he finds out that she's Jewish. We also have a archery contest, and during the archery contest, there's this man named Loxley who crushes everybody. He's just insanely good. Meanwhile, the Black Mysterious Knight runs off into the forest, and in the forest, he comes upon a chapel and he comes upon a hermit who doesn't want to let him in, but then eventually he does. This hermit is also a friar, and slowly the Black Knight and the hermit get super drunk together. They sing songs together, they get silly together. Meanwhile, our villains, De Bracy, has sort of fallen in love with Rowena, and so he decides to kidnap her. So the Saxons, namely Cedric, Rowena, Athelstane, and their servants, are on the way back from the Ashby tournament. And on their way, they encounter Isaac of York and his daughter Rebecca, who are traveling with an injured man. And Rowena begs Cedric to let Isaac and Rebecca join them because she knows they're Jewish, they need extra protection, and Cedric acquiesces. I like the fact that the girls in this novel stick up for each other. It's great. But of course, they're all traveling together and they get attacked because De Bracy wants Rowena, so he kidnaps all of them. Wamba manages to escape, and Wamba and Girth then come upon Loxley, who happens to be a leader of a group of outlaw men. And Loxley's like, okay, cool, I'll help you guys. I'll save the Saxons. And then Loxley takes Girth and Wamba to the chapel where they encounter the drunk hermit and Black Knight. Then altogether, this group decides to conspire to save the Saxons. At Front de Boeuf Castle, which is Torquilstone, De Bracy comes on to Rowena, asking for Rowena's hand in marriage. Rowena naturally is like, no thank you. And then she starts to cry, and De Bracy actually feels bad about it, which is a little surprising for his villain character. And meanwhile, Briand de Bois Guilbert has fallen for Rebecca. He's smitten, he saw her at the tournament, and so she's captured in a separate room. He comes on to her, and Rebecca threatens to jump off the tower if he touches her. And so as a result, Bois Guilbert is even more impressed with Rebecca. He starts to like her even more. And then poor Isaac is in a separate room and he's threatened with torture because he's Jewish and he has money. And then, of course, Cedric and Athelstane and the other Saxons are captured in a different room. And our band of good guys are meanwhile trying to break them out. There's some adventures along the way there, but they break into the castle, they rescue the group, although unfortunately Rebecca is captured by Bois Guilbert, and Athelstane tries to stop Bois Guilbert, but he's delivered a deathly blow, and he's presumably dead. Bois Guilbert takes Rebecca to Templestowe, which is the lair of the Knights Templar, and over there, the Grand Master thinks that Rebecca has bewitched Bois Guilbert, so he wants to put her on trial for witchcraft.
How could so noble a knight as Brian Guilbert be caught by this paramour?
She is obviously a sorceress.
Of course.
Meanwhile, Bois Guilbert has become even more smitten with Rebecca. He loves her officially. He wants to be with her. At the trial, a bunch of ridiculous accusations are levied against Rebecca. Obviously, she can't defend against any of them because they're ridiculous.
What makes you think she is a witch?
Well, she turned me into a newt.
A newt?
I got better.
Secretly, Bois Guilbert gives Rebecca a note that says she should ask for a champion to fight on her behalf, and so she does. And Isaac is allowed to leave to look for a champion for Rebecca. Bois Guilbert is even more head over heels for Rebecca. At this point, he's begging her to elope. He's ready to give up everything in his life to be with her, and still she's like, no. Meanwhile, in the forest, Wamba and the Black Knight are traveling when they're attacked. And Loxley and his men then jump in to save the group. And this is where we find out that the Black Knight is King Richard. And then Loxley confesses to King Richard that he is Robin Hood. And the hermit, the friar that the Black Knight drank with, is actually Friar Tuck. The good guys then all get together to mourn Athelstane. So they go to Athelstane's castle to mourn his death. And as it turns out, Athelstane is not dead. He has crawled out of his own coffin. And he shows up to the shock of everybody. And he tells Cedric, I'm not going to marry Rowena. It looks like Rowena and Ivanhoe are madly in love with each other. Let them be together. I don't need this. And Cedric reluctantly is like, okay, fine, that's cool. And they turn to Ivanhoe, but Ivanhoe has disappeared because he found out that Rebecca is in trouble. So he goes off to Templestowe to fight on Rebecca's behalf. And unfortunately, Ivanhoe is still badly injured. So at this point, Briand de Bois Guilbert has been assigned to fight against Rebecca to be the champion for the other side, even though he doesn't want to because he wants to be with Rebecca. So Ivanhoe charges Briand de Bois Guilbert. He barely grazes him. Ivanhoe falls, and then Briand de Bois Guilbert also falls, even though he was barely touched, because he has died of a broken heart. And at the very end, Ivanhoe and Rowena get married as they wanted to. Rebecca stops by to congratulate Rowena, to thank Ivanhoe, even though she's only talking to Rowena. Again, this is very much both are girls. They stand up for each other, they support each other. Rebecca is super nice to Rowena, and likewise, vice versa. And Rebecca says she's going to go off to Granada, Spain with her father. Like I mentioned, I really enjoyed reading this book. I thought it was a lot of fun. And I'm not going to get into the analysis of this novel as I don't have the credentials, but I do want to talk about some things that I thought were very interesting. And the first thing is the anti Semitism. Ivanhoe does present Jews in a sympathetic light. It shows the level of discrimination that Jews experienced, but the terminology is just savage.
Daughter of an accursed race, follow me.
It's just very, very harsh. And this is one element where Sir Walter Scott was correct. European Jews in the 12th centuries were reviled by Christians. They were abused and insulted by everyone around them. They were blamed for their practice of usury, which is the lending money and collecting interest. And also, they were coveted for their vast wealth. There was also a tax placed on Jews during this period of time, and ostensibly, this tax was a reprisal for their practice of usury. Ivanhoe does present Jews in a sympathetic light. Specifically, Rebecca is the most sympathetic and I would argue probably the most liked character in the novel. She's consistently pure, honorable, she's strong, she's intelligent, she's beautiful, she is a great healer, so she's just, again, like I said, a woman of all trades. Generally, people like Rebecca. And also, Rebecca is modeled after a real woman, Rebecca Gratz, who Sir Walter Scott met through his acquaintance, Washington Irving. Isaac doesn't quite get the same treatment. Isaac, like I mentioned, is modeled after Shylock from The Merchant of Venice, which is written by Shakespeare. And kind of like Shylock, Isaac really loves his money. And there are a few lines in the novel where it is kind of stereotypical. He's presented as someone who kind of almost loves money as much as he loves his family. So one line that sticks out for me is
Isaac recalled to think of his worldly goods, the love of which, by dint of inveterate habit, contended even with his parental affection.
There's also another point where at the end, after Ivanhoe wins for Rebecca and they're ready to leave, Rebecca wants to go, but Isaac wants to thank Ivanhoe for fighting on her behalf. And Rebecca, I believe she wanted to run away because she just didn't want to face Ivanhoe because she had a crush on him. And she tells Isaac, hey, but listen, King Richard is over there. And Isaac is like, oh shit, yeah, you're right, let's go. He's probably going to ask for money. Another line, which I think shows the level of discrimination against Jews, is when Bois Gilbert is pleading with Rebecca to be with him. And he says,
when I gaze on thee, and think when and how we are next to meet, I could even wish myself one of thine own degraded nation.
And he doesn't even mean this as an insult. To him, he's just being sincere and honest by saying, I'm willing to be part of your degraded nation to be with you. He means that as a compliment. Another thing that I liked about this book were the characters. Like I mentioned before, the characters I don't think were necessarily deep. Most of them did not go through an arc or an evolution or growth. I would say that Rebecca and Briand de Bois Gilbert were the most nuanced and complex characters. Even Ivanhoe, even though he is the titular character, he is basically immobile for most of the novel. So after he's hurt at Ashby, he basically does not, he's injured the entire time. And I think that's really funny. Some people have complained about that, but I think it makes the book funnier. The fact that Ivanhoe really is not the hero that he is supposed to be. I also really liked Athelstane. So Athelstane in the beginning is incredibly apathetic. We first meet him at Cedric's castle, then we meet him at the Ashby tournament. And the tournament, it's clear that he doesn't really feel like participating, even though Cedric is all about the Saxons, but Athelstane seems to just not care. And then where I really started to like Athelstane is when they're captured. So they're at Turkelstone, they're prisoners, and Cedric is going on and on about the Saxon plight. And he's just pissed off, he's angry, he hates the fact that the Normans are in power. Meanwhile, Athelstane cannot stop thinking about lunch.
Not lunch.
He is so preoccupied with what kind of food they're going to have, what kind of food is going to be available, what time they're going to be eating. And I have never related more to a character before. And then at the end, he didn't really seem to be a bad guy. I mean, he did try to stop the Templar Knights when they were storming the castle, and he did survive his own burial. He crawled out of his own coffin. And he even told Cedric, hey, listen, it looks like Ivanhoe and Rowena have the hots for each other. Let them be together. So Athelstan was willing to step aside. He's not the bad guy. And I loved his beef with the clergy because they're the ones who buried him. It's great. Athelstan is great. The other characters that I believe deserve more credit are Wamba and Girth. Wamba specifically, he seems to be Really clever, brave, reasonable, but he's treated like a jester. And it does make sense to me. So he calls himself a fool. Other people call him a fool, but he reminded me a little bit of the Scarecrow from The Wizard of Oz. So someone who thinks they're dumb, but who is actually incredibly intelligent. I mean, he pretended to be a clergyman to sneak into the castle when Wamba and the Black Knight are attacked in the forest. It's Wamba who picks up the cues and the fact that they're about to be attacked. I have left out a bunch of parts where Wamba and Girth are together. They have more interactions. Girth also seems to be very sympathetic. They seem to be good friends, Girth and Wamba. They stick up for each other. Girth also has a lot of love and sympathy for his dog, Fangs. So, as a whole, they seem to be kind of fun characters, and I feel like they deserve a lot more credit. I feel like they were more valuable than even Ivanhoe. I don't know if I'm being too bold in saying that, but I feel like Wamba is the real MVP of this novel, and no one talks about it. I also loved the twists and turns that Scott took with the characters. I mean, a lot of it was kind of obvious that the pilgrim in the beginning, the fact that it's Ivanhoe, you could see that a mile away, but it's still fun. It adds to the adventure. With the Black Knight, I didn't really pick up on that until he captured De Bracy, and then it became apparent, but that was a fun little reveal. And of course, Robin Hood and Friar Tuck. Did not pick up on Friar Tuck. Robin Hood, I figured out he was Robin Hood. I didn't think he was going to say it flat out, but it's fun. It's fun with these lots of little reveals as it comes along the way. And the book is also super funny. I chuckled a few times, and I don't usually laugh at books, but I think a part of that is the language, the fact that it's written in Shakespearean English, and the fact that they say silly things in combination just comes out super funny for me. And there are just a few lines in there that I thought were just really, really amusing. Specifically, the whole interaction with the Black Knight and the Hermit. The whole time, the Hermit is calling the Black Knight things like Sir Slothful Knight, and they get super drunk together, and their just interaction is super amusing. As a whole, it's a good time. I think this book is worth a read.